Because with Wales now in alert level 0, what does this mean for businesses and employers? Now, Elissa Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlis Solicitors in North Wales, is here to guide us through the changes and to answer your questions on employment law, whether you're an employee or an employer. Welcome back, Elissa. Now then, so we're alert level 0. Does that mean that the workplace is back to normal?
Good afternoon, Carol. It doesn't, unfortunately. Alert level 0 kind of sounds like something from a sci-fi film. I don't quite like the label, to be honest.
And
I think it is. And I think it's a bit misleading when we talk about level 0, because whilst things have dramatically relaxed, there's still some restrictions in place, and there's still lots of rules for employers to follow.
We've heard about these risk assessments, haven't we, on premises? Businesses and employers have got to undertake these coronavirus risk assessments, and that you're allowed to ask to see them. But what does this actually mean, Elissa?
So a risk assessment doesn't need to be overcomplicated. Essentially, what you're doing is looking at the workplace, looking at where the risks are in relating to COVID. So what we say is look at the pinch points. Where do people come in close contact? Where are people, sharing items or touching the same things? Those are the points where you're going to have some risk, and what can you do to reduce that risk?
For example, by a bar or by tills in a retail store, yeah?
Exactly, yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Shielding has now gone.
Yes.
What about those who can be described as vulnerable? What about their rights when they go, or if they go back to work, and if they can choose not to go back?
So whilst we haven't got shielding anymore, what we're saying is that employers should still be very mindful that they might have vulnerable employees. They should factor that into their risk assessment and make sure that those people are safe in the workplace. Employers have got a duty to ensure the workplace is safe. And if, they can't put measures in place to keep those people safe, they need to look at things like working from home potentially. And if that's not workable, perhaps there's some other options.
But if you were to have a doctor's letter, though, Elissa, stating that you've got a particular health condition that might make you vulnerable, or a mental health issue, because those numbers have gone through the roof during the pandemic, haven't they?
Yes.
Does this make any difference if you have a doctor's note?
It does, in terms of obviously showing what it is that the employer is dealing with, and in terms of what that condition is and where the risk might be. But in terms of shielding and that absolute right to stay at home, we don't have that anymore. So I do think we're going to see some friction. I do think we're going to see some legal challenges to some of the decisions that businesses are making.
And talking of mental health, how widespread is or are considerations for mental health in the workplace these days? Are employers more sensitive to it?
I think employers are definitely becoming more aware. Sort of in the employment field, so generally people who are doing what I do, we're almost calling this like the second pandemic. It's the mental health issue is something that's really brewed over the last 18 months, and I think we're going to really see it hit a peak once the restrictions are entirely relaxed and government expects people to get back to life as normal.
There are people out there who are suffering from long COVID as well, which sounds horrendous, doesn't it? Just when you think you've got over it, and then the fatigue hits you again and the symptoms reappear. How does this affect employment law? How does this affect the employer's rights then?
So in terms of long COVID, I think what we're going to see coming out of that is, for the people who are really suffering to quite a severe scale, is decisions on whether that's classed as a disability or not. If for certain individuals, because it's not one size fits all, but for individuals who have it to a very severe extent, if it's classed as a disability, then they're protected by the Equality Act and protected against disability discrimination. For those who don't meet that criteria, it will be dealt with in the same way as any other illness that employers are dealing with in terms of absence management and capability and things like that.
It's tough on the employer, actually, isn't it, now? Because there are so many fine lines here. So I guess they have to be very patient and very tolerant.
Absolutely. There's so many legal issues in play. There's a real mesh of different legislations, different issues, and a lot of this is very new. This isn't something that most of us have ever lived through before.
Of course.
Never mind, how to navigate in terms of a modern day, very litigious society. So certainly when we're speaking to employers, we're saying try and show some patience. There isn't necessarily an answer for everything, and it affects everybody differently.
Yeah, it is. It's been I'll almost say revolutionary, really, because we've had to rethink so many things, haven't we, during the last 18 months, however long it's been now. I've lost count, but there are so many new things to consider, aren't there?
100%. I mean, 18 months ago, working from home was still something relatively novel. And there was, sort of the running joke in businesses where the perception of anyone working from home was, they're watching daytime TV, they're not really doing anything. And then the world changed. And all of a sudden, it's become one of the most commonplace things. A day doesn't go by, you don't talk to someone who isn't working from home. I'm working from home right now. And I think certainly it's revolutionized the workplace and how we look at how people work.
Yeah, we'll talk about that later on if that's okay. But let's just talk before we go to the next song about the furlough scheme. What's the latest on that? Because that was a lifeline to many during the pandemic, wasn't it? And still is in some cases. But what's the latest?
So furlough comes to an end at the end of September. So we've got a month and a half-ish left to go. At the moment, the government's only contributing 60% of people's wages up to a maximum of £1,875 per month. September's going to be the same, so that contribution won't change. And at the moment, employers have to contribute 20% of a worker's wages, and then 20% is left unpaid. So employees are still being paid for 80% of their normal pay whilst they're on furlough. But we are going to see that wrapping up in the next 6 or 7 weeks.
Oh dear, that's worrying as well, isn't it? It's been such so many ups and downs. Well, lots of downs actually. But maybe you've got some more answers to put people's mind at rest. And if you want to know what your rights are as an employee or an employer, Elissa Thursfield is with us. She's taking your questions on employment law. Elissa, we've had a question from David in Wrexham. He says, "Hi both, I'm hoping you can help me. I've worked for an agency for the last 5 months, same job, full-time as a parts delivery driver. My father passed away 3 weeks ago, and I called the agency to ask if I was entitled to any compassionate leave, but they said that I wasn't entitled to any type of leave, and I found this rather strange. Was this right?" Well, David, really sorry to hear about your dad, but how does he stand with the company, Elissa?
That's a really hard one, and it's difficult when you work for an agency because often you're changing between who it is that you're working for, and it's hard to sort of form a connection with your employer as well, so that when something like this happens, it can make it all the more distressing. So first off to David, very sorry for your loss. Unfortunately, in the UK, when it comes to time off for things like compassionate leave, it's very, very restrictive, and if they're saying to him that contractually or under their own policies they don't have anything in place, then he's likely to struggle in terms of paid leave. So he could potentially take unpaid leave, he could take some annual leave, but there isn't any sort of pay that he's likely to be eligible for, unfortunately.
Oh, that's sad, isn't it? That's something you don't really want to deal with when you've had a bereavement, but that's the law, and sorry we can't be more help for you there, David, but as you say, unpaid leave or annual leave, yeah, Elissa?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Thanks for your call, David. I hope it helps you out a bit. Anyway, and if you've got a question you'd like to ask Elissa, it's easy. You just give us a call on 03700 100 110, or you can text 81012. I'd like to talk to you about pinging, please, Elissa, because that has caused mayhem, hasn't it? What's the law regarding self-isolation if you've been pinged?
So at the moment, if you've had both vaccinations and you're 2 weeks clear of your second vaccination, so it was at least 2 weeks ago, if you get pinged, then you're free to go. You're free to go out. what we were calling Pingdemic. So prior to the rules changing, if you got pinged, you were stuck inside for up to 10 days. It happened to me. It was absolutely awful. It's meant that businesses have ground to a halt. They've not been able to get staff. So there was a big collective sigh of relief when the rules changed. However, we're not quite there yet. A lot of sort of younger people in the workforce haven't necessarily had both vaccinations yet. So if you haven't had both vaccinations, you've got to apply with the rules of test and trace, unfortunately.
Okay. What about the app itself? Is it still there, is it?
The app's still there. What we're actually seeing is less and less people actually using it. So we're either seeing people turn off their Bluetooth or deleting the app altogether. Right. There were issues being reported, for example, where you've got staff who perhaps all have to leave their phones in one place at work, and someone unfortunately walks past who then tests positive. All those phones then get pinged. Yeah. We were hearing about people who live in terraced houses and getting pinged through walls and things like that. I mean, these are stories that we've heard. How much truth there is them, we don't know. But, it's been a bit of a nightmare. In terms of getting pinged versus actually being contacted by test and trace, there was lots of stuff in the press about how there's no legal obligation to stay in. However, when it comes to an employment perspective, what we are saying to businesses is that you should be advising your employees to stay home if they are pinged, because if they have been in touch with someone who's positive and that leads to an outbreak on your workforce, that's a bigger problem to deal with than one employee being pinged.
Do they have the right to tell the employee then to go for a test, a PCR test, rather than what's the other one called? I can't remember. The lateral flow, yes.
Yeah, so if someone gets contacted by test and trace, I believe they are actually have to go for a PCR test anyway. And if someone has symptoms, they can actually then obviously book their own. But certainly you can be asking them to take a lateral flow test as a matter of course anyway.
Okay, thank you for that. Let's talk now about masks and social distancing. Where do we stand? I know that here in the BBC in Cardiff, we're all wearing our masks really as soon as we're out of the studio, but there's nobody here with me anyway. They're all behind the glass ignoring me, but that's another story. No, but but once we're out of the studio mixing, the masks are on. Is this true of everywhere?
Yep, so unless you are hospitality premises, so hospitality, masks can be off. So if you go down to the pub, you may find, that they're saying no masks. Other premises, it is still the requirement that you have to wear masks. Now, I say that about hospitality, they can make their own decisions as well where they ask people to wear them. So even though they're released from that requirement, we are still seeing some venues that are being quite risk averse and want people to continue to wear them. But if you're going into shops, if you're at work, then they should still be worn.
Okay, this is what I think has been confusing people, is the difference between workplace and nightclubs. Isn't it? What's the difference between wearing a mask and not wearing a mask in work and not wearing a mask when you go out for a meal or when you go to a nightclub?
Yeah, because I suppose we all know you can't catch COVID in a nightclub, can you? It's it's obviously like a very safe place to be.
Yeah.
The rationale behind it, I can't explain it.
No.
I
think we just have to trust the experts on that one, don't we?
I think it's part of this whole getting people back to normal life and slowly releasing certain elements of life. And I think it's quite hard to swallow when you're an employer and you've got employees who are really towing the line. It might not be that pleasant, particularly if they've got to have them on all day, but then they can go to a nightclub at night and everything's back to normal. Yeah. It's just the situation we're in, and again, it's just patience all round that's required, really.
This is really great stuff. Thank you, Elissa. We talked about masks just before the travel update. Can I ask you what the law says about someone who refuses to wear a mask at work?
Okay, so where we're seeing this is people who say that they've got some sort of exemption generally, though we do see some pockets of people who just say that they just don't want to wear them. The exemption rule has been there all the way through. The rules are slightly different over whether you're dealing with a member of the public or whether you're dealing with an employee. But it's generally accepted that you shouldn't be asking members of the public why they're not wearing one. Their exemption is their own business, essentially.
Okay.
If it's an employee, our advice has generally been deal with this in the same way as you would any other medical issue that causes an issue at work. So say, for example, if someone says, because I've got this condition, it means I can't do this part of my job, that will be dealt with through a process whereby you'd ask to see medical records, perhaps you'd ask them to see occupational health, you'd have discussions and consultations with that employee over what they can and can't do, and then try and come up with a mutually acceptable position. With masks, it should be the same. It shouldn't be a case of get off my premises, you're not wearing a mask. It should be conversation as to, look, what's the issue? Is there anywhere else we can put you or redeploy you to reduce the risk level? Is there anything else we can do before sending that employee home and saying, look, don't come back until you're prepared to wear a mask?
That's going to be a nasty conversation, isn't it? If somebody is morally objecting to them, gosh, as we say, once again, employers have to be patient and tolerant, don't they?
I mean, if it's a moral objection and someone's saying, look, I don't believe in COVID, I just don't want to wear one, that's a slightly different situation, because you're not sort of making allowances for someone's disability or a medical condition. If someone just says, I just don't want to wear one, there's no medical reason why, I'm just objecting, then potentially that could be a failure to follow a reasonable management instruction, which could lead to a disciplinary.
Oh, there you go. Now you know. Right, let's move away from the masks now. I've got another nice sci-fi term for you. We've had, what was the first one?
Alert level zero.
Alert level zero. Hybrid working. Okay, so when the employees can mix working from home and working in their workplace. Is this mandatory by now?
No, it's not. So we're still in the same position as we were technically pre-COVID, which is if your contract of employment specifies that you work from your employer's offices or specifies a particular location that you work from, that can only be changed through agreement with your employer. So if you want to continue to work from home, if you want a hybrid working arrangement, it might not be you who wants it. It might be your employer that wants a hybrid working arrangement. That still needs to be agreed with both parties because it's classed as a change of contract.
Do you think, off topic a little bit here, Elissa, but do you think people have preferred working from home, or have they missed the camaraderie and the actual? Because I remember when I did some broadcasting from home at the beginning of the pandemic, and then this brand spanking new, very safe building opened in the middle of Cardiff, and I have to say, although it was nice broadcasting from my pajamas, it was, I did have to get up and wash and put proper clothes on and see people from afar, I know. But have people adjusted the way they're working? And is working from home becoming more popular, not only in an environmental sense, because, it cuts down on a lot of costs, doesn't it, for the employer, but also from a time management point of view?
It does. I think there's been a real mix in terms of whether people have loved it or hated it. And every time I talk to someone, the response is slightly different. So, some people have loved being able to be at home. It's made things easier in terms of pets and kids and, running a busy household. But then you've got some people who feel very lonely, feel very isolated, very much miss, the camaraderie that comes with being at work, being able to go out for lunch or, pop to the shops in your lunch hour and things like that. So I think there's been a real sort of mixed attitude towards it. I've got a brother who lives in London. He couldn't wait to get back into his office. Whereas for me, I have a 77-mile commute each way. I've regained 3 hours of my life every day that mostly, I'll confess, is spent working. But I feel, it's made me more productive.
Of course, yes. And can you request to split your time between home and office to suit your lifestyle?
So you can. So when you put in a flexible working request, it doesn't need to be anything as dramatic as I need to care for somebody or I've got childcare responsibilities or anything like that. It purely can be, I want flexible working because I would like a better work-life balance, or I need some quiet time working away from the office to get my head down with complicated jobs and things like that. And you'd put in a flexible working request as you would have done pre-pandemic. Nothing has really changed in that respect.
And how receptive are employers to that?
Some are being very modern about it. I'll say modern. It's now that the current way that we're working. They are being much more receptive. I think businesses are seeing that, perhaps they can downsize some of their offices, their overheads aren't as high, and indeed the COVID risks are lower. So they feel like those who are in the office, things are able to get a little bit more back to normal. But then we're still seeing some who very much want to get their employees back and feel like the soul of their businesses has been ripped out, and that actually, it feels like they're working in a bit of a ghost town.
I suppose it depends on the business as well, doesn't it?
Very much so, yes. And I think, where you've got people who perhaps aren't interacting with other people much in a day. So, I'm working in very isolated roles anyway. It doesn't necessarily matter where they're working from. But in some, we hear some teams reporting that they feel that collaboration is missed out on. And that whilst, yes, you've got things like Teams and Zoom and Skype, it's not quite the same as just bumping into someone in the corridor and saying, oh, actually, I've just, while I've seen you, let's have a quick chat about this. And it's that sort of thing that seems to be getting lost.
Yeah. And you have to clean your house. Or at least the back of your back of the screenshot on Zoom.
I'll confess, my office looks pristine on camera, but it's a different story on the other sort of 270 degrees that can't be seen.
You are not alone. Okay, Elissa, let's talk about the vaccine now. And Wales, there's a very high uptake of it in Wales. Can you ask, if you're an employer, can you ask your staff whether they've had the vaccine?
So there's loads of sort of contentious commentary around this, with people saying you absolutely can't do it, it's very private. Our view is that in circumstances you can. So with the new rules in terms of Pingdemic, so for employees who are double vaccinated, they can go out. The only way you can know as an employer whether that's going to catch your workforce or not, or which parts of your workforce it's going to catch, is if you know about their vaccination status.
Right.
So knowing whether someone's had a vaccination or not is technically, under GDPR, so the data protection rules, what's called as a special category of personal data. It's medical information. So you need to make sure that you've got a really good, valid reason for knowing that information. And what we're saying is, if you need to inform your risk assessment.
Oh, Elissa is. Are you there? Sorry, we lost you for a bit there, Elissa. Sorry.
Sorry.
No, it's all right. The Abersoch satellite went behind the cloud or something.
Obviously.
So you were saying about the access to information as to whether you've been vaccinated or not, and whether you can actually access that information.
Yeah. So what we're saying is that you can, because if you need to establish whether or not someone's going to be caught by being pinged or test and trace, you need to understand who's been vaccinated or not. You just need to make sure that that's the only reason you're processing that information. It's the only reason why you're collecting that information. You shouldn't be telling other staff members who's been vaccinated. You shouldn't be telling any third parties who's been vaccinated. It should purely be for the purposes of informing your risk assessment. It might be that you decide to bring people back to work who've been vaccinated, or put people on alternating shifts and things like that. And to make those decisions, you're going to need to know whether someone's vaccinated or not. Now, what we say is when you're storing that information, you shouldn't be storing it next to like somebody's name or anything like that. You need to come up with a code so that if, for example, there's a data protection breach and that information is released, that there isn't information out there that could be in the public arena over who's had a vaccination or not.
How about if there's an employee refusing to come back to work until he or she knows that everybody's been vaccinated?
So in those circumstances, which we're seeing more and more,
really?
Ultimately, it's down to the employer to say, look, we've done a risk assessment. We've decided the workplace is safe enough for you to come back. If you're objecting, then you're either absent without authorization or you can request unpaid leave. If someone ultimately refuses to come back to work because of that, then it's likely to be potentially classed as a disciplinary offence.
Okay. One last question for you, Elissa. Thanks ever so much for everything today. Is that your dog?
It is, sorry. Yes.
Oh, right. I thought you'd had a cold or fallen over, but I'm glad it was your dog. Is he all right or she all right?
He's fine, yeah, don't worry.
Good. Okay. Holiday season. Okay, where people are excited to go on holiday when where it's safe to go. So, If we have to self-isolate after coming back from a holiday abroad, are we entitled to full pay?
So, if you've already booked off an isolation period in advance because you may be very good at planning or super cautious, you'll get paid your annual leave for that period because it's technically holiday. However, if you only book, for example, a week off,
Yeah.
and when you get back from holiday, you have to isolate for a week, 10 days. If you haven't already booked that off and your employer's expecting you back at work, that's going to be unpaid. You're not going to get paid for that.
Right. So that is a really good point, isn't it? So when you're booking your holiday, and if you've decided to take a last minute break, is to insert or to take into consideration the isolation period as well.
Yes, and have a think about whether, just to be cautious or to cover yourself, you need to book some extra time off. Because if your employer's not expecting you back, then great. As far as they're concerned, you've taken a longish holiday, and that's absolutely fine.
Yes.
But if you haven't communicated particularly well and the situation changes and you have to isolate when you get back, then understandably your employer's likely to be annoyed if they expect you to turn up on a Monday and you're going to be off for another week.
Elissa, you are an absolute gem. You've got so much knowledge and advice to give out there, and it's been very informative. And we've all learned something today. Thank you so much for joining us. And I hope, well, I don't know, if you're enjoying working from home, long may that last, Elissa.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thank you. Because with Wales now in alert level 0, what does this mean for businesses and employers? Now, Elissa Thursfield, Head of Employment Law at Gamlis Solicitors in North Wales, is here to guide us through the changes and to answer your questions on employment law, whether you're an employee or an employer. Welcome back, Elissa.